Thank you, Cecil, Chip, and Roger for your leadership and insights. Our next speaker is Adam Sachs, the president of Tourism Economics, an Oxford economics company dedicated to analytical-based consulting to the tourism sector. Adam has over 2 decades of experience working with different facets of travel and tourism industry across the globe in the areas of economic impact, opportunity, risk assessment, and policy analysis. His work examining the economic merits of travel facilitation, taxation, and tourism promotion initiative has been key to influencing critical government policies. As an authority on measuring the economic impact of visitor activity, Adam provides valuable analysis and insight on the impacts of hotels and destination marketing. Adam is also a member of the U.S. Department of Commerce Travel and Tourism Advisory Board. Today, he'll be discussing the U.S. economic and travel outlook for 2020 and beyond. Please help me welcome Adam Sachs.
Well, thank you. It's great to be together virtually today. I have the privilege and the challenge of sharing the economic context that we're working in right now as an industry, as well as where we think things are headed for the economy and for the broader travel industry, and of course for the lodging industry in the US. So let's go ahead and get started. Just as an opening perspective, of course, this year will indeed be a year to forget, with unique challenges that we've not faced before. But if we look at the industry as a whole, and this is data that we compiled for the U.S. Travel Association, we're tracking monthly travel spending by both domestic and U.S. inbound travelers. And you can see how bad things were in April, with a nearly 90% drop in travel. That's basically life support, standstill situation. In each month since then, the situation has improved. And July appears to be coming in at around 55% down, which still is dramatically bad. But I think that we can say that the worst is behind us, and that performance does continue to improve around the country. In fact, as we look at data on a weekly basis, this is also travel spending in the US for the US Travel Association, we're seeing that things are leveling off at around 50% lower than a year ago. And so it seems like right now, given the current state of affairs, that this is where we are, at least where we've been for the last month or so. Meanwhile, lodging sector does continue to make improvements along the way. But the disparity by different segment, by different property type, has perhaps never been as great as it has been. Looking at STR data for the month of June, you can see how clearly, just focusing on demand, how clearly the economy class, mid-scale class, and upper mid-scale are outperforming the luxury class and upper upscale class. And that reflects a number of things. It reflects the concentration of those higher end properties in cities. It also reflects the exposure to groups, and group demand, of course, has fallen to almost non-existent levels over the last 5 months. And so there's a real disparity in performance by type of property and by type of chain scale. But it's also based on where they are, where the properties are. And we look at, for just the week ending July 25th, what states have been performing the best in terms of total travel spending. They are those states that are more rural, outdoor destinations. Mississippi, South Dakota, Idaho, Delaware as a beach destination, Wyoming, Montana. But the worst markets are those where they're dominated by urban centers, and of course Hawaii as well as a fly market. When you look at STR data, overlay that on the right-hand side, you see the exact same thing, where occupancy rates are highest in some of those rural, Midwestern, and beach destinations, and they are lowest in those destinations that are really anchored by urban markets. So I'm going to share with you the economic indicators that we are tracking on a real-time basis that I think are the most helpful in understanding what direction we're headed in. We'll start with the data point that probably none of us missed that was released just the other week, which was GDP in the second quarter, which fell 33%. Never before seen. One of the things that we do need to keep in mind is that that's an annualized basis. What that means is that the economy did not contract by a third. It means that if it continued to contract at the same rate for a full year, it'd be 33%. It actually winds up to be about 10% down in the third quarter. It's exactly what we had predicted, or at least within a close margin of about 30%. So not a big surprise, but indeed historically dramatic, but also somewhat meaningless. And I'll explain why in a minute. First, it's historic, right? Because if you look at that 10%, the effective contraction in the third quarter, you have to go back to the post-World War II demobilization to see anything like it, and then of course before that, the Great Depression. But more than twice as bad as the trough in the Great Financial Crisis. So it is indeed historic, but it's also meaningless because it's what's behind us in the rearview mirror, and it's very much a function of the lockdowns across the country. So what do we have now? Where are we headed now? That's what's of course going to be a lot more meaningful. Well, one of the things that we're tracking to get to that understanding of the current state is a composite of economic indicators and indicators tracking the movement of persons, and also those tracking the state of the virus itself, to get a sense of what is the state and the health of the economy right now. And so we're tracking this on a weekly basis, and it's a number of data inputs from Flight Radar, from Google, from Open Table, and our own economic data as well. And the composite of it basically tells this simple story, that we've really began to pick up pace in May and June. But then when we got to July, things have plateaued. And that's consistent with what I shared with you a little while ago, with some of the spending data kind of plateauing at around 50% off of where it was a year ago. So that real-time data, I think, is very, very helpful. We're also tracking what's going on with consumption, because, of course, consumers in the end are going to be what keep the economy afloat and recovering. And a similar story here in that overall consumer demand, as we're tracking it on this index, which is the dotted line, you could see that it recovered strongly through May and most of June, but then in recent weeks has basically leveled off at a level below where it was at the beginning of the year. Restaurants in particularly dire shape. Credit cards still off. The only real bright spot is home sales and refinancing, which is above where it was at the beginning of the year. The jobs recovery, again, same story, a strong recovery that we saw in late spring, early summer, and then leveling off as we look at things like temporary employment, job postings, and hour works. These are much higher frequency data than you'll see in those monthly BLS reports that come out a couple of weeks after the end of the month. And so the perspective that we're getting here as well is that the labor market, though posted some initial pullback, some gains off of the losses in April, those gains have indeed leveled off as well. And so where we are is an economy that's still down 15 million jobs from where it was at the beginning of the year. And that is likely where we're going to be, in that vicinity over the next couple of months. And part of the reason that we think that we're not going to see a big jump in employment is simply looking at unemployment benefits, which are still adding about 1 million each week. And so it's unlikely that that means that we're going to be net positive on jobs in any significant degree over the next few months, which means that we really do need to look forward to development on the science side in terms of therapeutics, treatments, and eventually a vaccine before we're going to see full healing in the labor market. So where do we think this is headed? I was going to share with you our latest perspectives on real-time data. Well, let me share with you first I think the key kind of a priori assumptions that are going to form the outlook as I share it with you. And we could think about those assumptions regarding the future in three categories: the timeline for the pandemic, the policy response, and then what's going on with the economy. And these are somewhat sequential in time as well as causal. What happens in the first affects the second, and that affects the third. In terms of the pandemic itself, it seems clear that the virus is going to remain a defining factor for travel and for the hotel industry through the first quarter of 2021, and possibly into the second quarter as well. Progress, we assume that it'll be continued progress on treatment, but no groundbreaking game changers in our baseline forecast, although that does remain an upside risk to the outlook. And with that, the assumption that a vaccine becomes available in early 2021, and then distribution takes some number of months from there. Secondly, we want to think about what is the policy response. And the key feature of our assumption on the policy response is that we will not go back to the degree of lockdown that we experienced in the spring. But while we've certainly seen states and communities, cities have to pause reopening, and in some cases impose new measures, be it closing of bars or requirements for masks, that we don't think that the economy nor society or politics will bear another prolonged, full-on lockdown at a state level. And that really, I think, supports the premise that the worst is behind us. While we do have a long road ahead of us for recovery, we are officially in the rebuild phase. International borders, in terms of policy, they're going to be very slow to reopen. I think there's a decent chance we get Canada-US border open before the end of the year. But major markets for international travel are going to be slow to reopen even into 2021. And even if they do, the reality is that there's not a lot of pent-up demand for travel to the US right now due to the state of the virus. For the economy, the US economy is in recession right now, and we expect it for the year to fall 4.2%. And nevertheless, there's going to be a nice pickup in economic activity as we get to the latter part of this year and into 2021 due to pent-up demand, due to historic government stimulus. But the reality is that even as the economy accelerates, it's going to be behind where it would have been. So here's a picture of our US GDP forecast from our parent company, Oxford Economics. And you can see that we've broken up the recovery into basically two phases. Phase one, where there's a good pickup that's on the back of government stimulus and reopening. And then phase two, where things grow at a more moderate pace, but are recovering. And then we really wind up below that pre-virus GDP path. I should say that the risks are skewed to the downside right now. And those are particularly related to risks related to the virus itself. But why do we think things are going to pick up? I mean, one of the reasons is the sheer level of stimulus impact that has already been put to work. We're already looking at $3 trillion. That's going to top $4 trillion before the end of August in all likelihood. You compare that to all that was put to work after the Great Financial Crisis, which topped out at $2 trillion when you add up everything that Congress approved. And you can see this sheer scale of government stimulus, that as lockdowns continue to be eased and as the economy continues to open up, that's going to really be wind in the sails for the US economy. The labor market, similarly, a two-phase market recovery. So we've already experienced some of that initial rebound in the data for June. We'll probably see a little bit of rebound in July, but then it begins to level off, and the final gains are going to be more hard-won. Now, that said, one of the realities for the travel industry, for the hotel industry, is that Because most of those job losses have been in that lower quintile of income, it means that travel will be relatively less affected than the broader economy, because those who travel the most, spend the most in hotels, have been relatively less affected in terms of job losses and income than those on the lower end of the income scale. This is a bit of a loose schedule for where we can begin to see markets to recover. Right now, we are in the initial phase of the rebounds with domestic leisure drive travel really composing most of the hotel room demand right now, a little bit of domestic leisure fly as well. So that's where that has begun. It won't be until the latter part of this year where we'll begin to see essential meetings, small and medium-sized events, but a limited number. And then, as I mentioned, I think there's the prospect of regional international, basically being Canada and possibly Mexico before the end of the year. It's not until next year, and as we look at it with each passing date, it seems likely the second half of next year that we'll begin to see large events take place again, and then long-haul international again. So there we're looking at a full year out before we begin to see the advent of these segments begin to really recover. Now, these markers in time are the beginnings of recovery, not the full realization of recovery. Full realization in terms of volume of people or room demand would actually be 2023 as we model it. Now, I mentioned earlier just a lot of disparity that we're seeing in terms of rural markets versus urban markets. But you can also see that disparity based on exposure to domestic markets and exposure to transient markets. Put it another way, the more exposed you are to group in a market, and the more exposed you are to international, the more exposed you are to this downturn. And the more exposed you are relatively to domestic travel, particularly drive, and transient, or primarily leisure, you're going to be more resilient and recover more quickly. And so what I did is I took the top 25 markets in the US based on STR data and added some Canadian markets, and just to look at which markets would fall in that upper right-hand quadrant. That is, the relatively overexposed to domestic markets and to transient non-group room demand. And what we see is a number of key markets, Seattle, Philadelphia, Houston, Boston, Tampa, Norfolk, Minneapolis, kind of in that upper right-hand quadrant. Now, they're still in the urban centers that are going to struggle simply as a function of that. But as we get in recovery, those markets that are in that upper right-hand quadrant are in a better position than those in the lower left-hand quadrant, which are more exposed to group, more exposed to international. So it becomes incumbent upon property owners, managers, destination marketing organizations to pivot toward those drive leisure markets and toward domestic as the counterparts to those are slow to recover. We see in survey data just a dramatic reshuffling of the deck right now. This is from Longwoods International, and miles every week they release this. And we see that 27%, 1 in 4 respondents to their survey are saying that they changed from a fly trip to a drive trip. So clearly travel is being regionalized right now. And 1 in 5 has changed their trip from international to domestic. That is a U.S. resident saying, I'm not going to travel abroad, I'm going to take a trip domestically. Right? Now, that really can make a big difference in the way that we think about our markets and marketing. If I index to the beginning of March, drive trips and air trips, you can see the drive trips didn't fall as far, and they've come back more quickly than air trips. So this affects who our customers are, of course. Keep in mind that drive trips have not fully recovered to where they would have been. They've only fully recovered to where they were in March, which is not where they should be in the peak drive summer months. So even drive trips are still off relative to a year ago, but you can see obviously a big change in the way that people are moving around. Now, I mentioned that a lot of people are switching from a international outbound trip to a domestic trip. Well, this has a big implication as well, because if you imagine the possibility that all of the U.S. residents who are going to take an outbound vacation. Instead, take a domestic US vacation. How much, like this is the question, how much would it offset the loss in inbound? Well, I've answered the question here because inbound travel to the US represented 79 million visits in 2019. But there were 97 million outbound trips in the same year, which means that if you were to exchange one for the other, the US would actually be up 19 million trips if all those outbound trips get converted to domestic. So I'm going to leave you here with the idea that another front that we can address is the policy front. There are a number of policies that are being brought before Congress. One is a marketing campaign for domestic travel. One is a grant to destination marketing organizations. And one is a tax incentive that gives a credit of up to $4,000 per household, covering 50% of travel expenses if a trip is taken before the end of 2021. Suffice to say here that the impact of these initiatives, if they can be successfully navigated through Congress, would be significant. And in fact, would yield $71 billion in travel spending, $162 billion in economic impact. It would bring back jobs in the travel industry and the hospitality sector a lot quicker, some 744,000 jobs that would be restored by the end of 2021, a full 2 years earlier than they would have been otherwise. So a real opportunity here. I'll leave you with kind of our big picture forecast with STR. The first is that hotel room revenue, is going to be down 50% this year. However, it's going to rebound sharply in 2021 to be about 71% of 2019 levels by next year. And it won't come back to par, that is where it was in 2019, until 2024. And then in terms of room demand, we're going to get back quicker. Right? Rate is going to struggle as we regain occupancy. But room demand we expect to be down around 36%. And next year to be 86% of where it was in 2019. So things begin to feel more like normal as we move into the latter part of next year, reaching prior peaks in 2023. So let's end here with some guideposts for planning for the next 18 months. The first point that can guide us is that recovery has indeed begun. We are in the rebuild phase, notwithstanding some of the risks that do present real challenges as we move over the next, particularly 9 months. Performance by destination, it's going to be incredibly disparate over the next 9 months. And the difference in performance, depending on what market you're in, is going to be very much a function of your exposure to drive markets and leisure markets, the nature of the destination, the ability to pivot to recovering traveler markets, and then, of course, exposure to the pandemic itself as that evolves. There are indeed recovery initiatives that are being advocated for and championed, and to the extent that those can be approved, can make a big difference, especially the tax incentive, the marketing campaign, and the grants to destination marketing organizations all can make a big difference in getting us back to fully recovered status as soon as possible. So thank you for being with you today. It's been a pleasure.